Hello everyone, I am Dr. Kajal Mundada. Today we are going to discuss a very important book in almost all disciplines, and that is Edward Said's Orientalism. Edward Said was a professor of literature at Columbia University, a public intellectual and founder of the academic field of post-colonial studies. Orientalism is considered to be one of the most influential books of the modern era. It is on par with Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, Karl Marx's Das Kapital, and Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. This book quite accurately is said to have inaugurated the field of post-colonial studies or the post-colonial theory. The book is written with breathtaking erudition and an engaging style, of course for an academician or for the academics. Published in 1978, Orientalism was a book whose time had come. It appeared around the same time as the works of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Althusser, and the French feminists. Orientalism set in motion an intellectual turbulence that altered the shape and canon of Western and Eastern academia. The works of post-colonial writers in American, European, and South Asian university departments of English, comparative literature, and area studies have the abiding influence of this one text. Now we are going to understand this book chapter-wise systematically. Edward Said's Orientalism was published in the year 1978. This is perhaps one of the most influential texts of the 20th century. Orientalism revolutionizes the study of Middle East. The book is now translated in more than 26 languages. It is one of the most scholarly controversial books in the last 50 years. Gayatri Spivak calls it a source book, and Homi K. Bhabha refers to it as inaugurating the post-colonial field. His path-breaking work in this book and later ones such as Culture and Imperialism, his activist writings on the Palestine cause have made Said the leading intellectual of the post-colonial and marginalized people of the world. To understand Said's major contribution to critical thought and his Orientalism, it's important to know the ideologies that he adopts. For Said, a text's context is very important. Now, what is context? Context is the surrounding, circumstances, environment, or background that determine or specify the meaning of a book. So, for Said, a text's context is very important. This awkward relationship of text and context creates many of the dilemmas and the contractions upon which Said's most well-known work, Orientalism, is based or built. Orientalism is a synthesis of Antonio Gramsci's theories of hegemony and Michel Foucault's theories of discourse and knowledge as inextricably linked to power. So, to understand Orientalism, it is important first to see Michel Foucault's concept of discourse and Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony. Both Gramsci and Foucault sought to understand the mechanisms whereby power structures within society were maintained and replicated. They both rejected the top-down model of power being forcibly expressed as a simplistic subjugation of others. Gramsci developed the insight that material conditions of subjugation were also matched by the ideological conditions. Hegemony is the practice of the material and ideological reproductions of values. Dominant classes maintain their position not only through acts of coercion. Coercion means force or compulsion. So what Gramsci says? Dominant classes maintain their position not only through acts of coercion or force or compulsion, but also through symbolic action which renews and recreates the social order. Hegemony is the nexus. Nexus means the center of something or some sort of connection. So, hegemony is the nexus of material and ideological instruments through which the dominant classes maintain their power. Foucault's approach to power involves in part the study of discursive formations. Discursive means tending to digress or deviate from the main point. So his approach to power involves in part the study of discursive formations, that is to say, the mechanism via which knowledge is produced and delimited as a practice. In his book entitled The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault defines knowledge as a practical assemblage, a mechanism of statements and visibilities. Before Orientalism, Edward Said wrote a book entitled Beginnings, Intention and Method. This book was published in the year 1975. In order to understand Orientalism in a better way, it is really important to know a few concepts from the book Beginnings, Intention and Method. In this book, Said contrasts the concept of beginning with the metaphysical concept of the origin. So, he talks about two concepts, beginning and origin. These two concepts represent two different ways of thinking and of producing knowledge. The metaphysical origin is privileged, mythical and transient, asserting a point of universal truth, whereas secular beginning is contingent, ceaselessly re-examined and re-begun, restructuring and animating new ways of conceiving the world. Edward Said calls the beginning not an achieved result, as with the origin, but a task and a search, based upon Foucault's concept of genealogy. Well, what is concept of genealogy by Foucault? It is the examination of knowledge not as a progressive system, but as a series of ruptures and discontinuities. So, based upon Foucault's concept of genealogy, Said also argues for intentionality in the act of beginning. That is, what is the intention behind beginning the production of particular theory of knowledge, which is also creation of a necessary fiction. Most of Said's literary examples are modern canonical texts. In short, to understand Orientalism, it is important to understand that all will to knowledge is tied up with will to power. There can be no imposition or expression of power without prior knowledge about the subject of power. Edward Said argues that knowledge about Orient means Asia, the East and non-European cultures. Said argues that knowledge about Orient was not disinterested or knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It preceded actual colonial practices. In fact, colonial practices, be they political or economic, necessitated the production of such knowledge. Thus knowledge is bound up with power. The colonial power, based on Orientalist knowledge, does not rely on physical force as much as the consent, that is, the agreement or acceptance of the native. Also, these texts and discourses present the imperialist program as natural and necessary. The native agrees to be colonized when he accepts the colonial stereotypes of himself. The civil society apparatus of education, religion, after adopting the stereotype, justifies and consents to being colonized subjects. Thus, Said's synthesis of Antonio Gramsci and Michel Foucault reveals a discursive formation called Orientalism. That is, a productive, hegemonic, transdisciplinary body of Western knowledge that constructs and subjugates the Orient. Edward Said has divided this book in 3 chapters. Chapter 1 is given the title The Scope of Orientalism. In this, he talks about knowing the Oriental, imaginative geography and its representations, orientalizing the Oriental, projects, crisis. Chapter 2. The title of Chapter 2 is Orientalist Structures and Restructures. In this, there are subunits: redrawn frontiers, redefined issues, secularized religion. Sylvester D. Sassy and Ernest Renan, Rational Anthropology and Philological Laboratory. Oriental Residence and Scholarship. The Requirements of Lexicography and Imagination. Pilgrims and Pilgrimages, British and French. Chapter 3 is given the title Orientalism Now. In that, he talks about latent and manifest Orientalism, style, expertise, vision, Orientalism's worldliness, modern Anglo-French Orientalism in fullest flower, and the latest phase. Now let's try to see what Said has discussed in chapter 1. In the very first chapter, Said has defined an Orientalist and Orientalism. Means he talks about who is an Orientalist and what is Orientalism. According to him, an Orientalist is anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient. And this applies whether the person is an anthropologist, sociologist, historian, or psychologist, either in its specific or its general aspects. And what he or she does is Orientalism. Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient and the Occident. Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring and having authority over the Orient. European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. Said had cited 2 Orientalist projects in the 18th century. The first is Anquetil Duperron's translation of Avestan texts, revealing Oriental civilization to the Europeans. The second is that of William Jones, a justice of the High Court of Bengal and member of Bengal Asiatic Society, who compared and codified the arts and sciences of Asia. Said has placed specific emphasis on Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1978. This invasion was the very model of a truly scientific appropriation of one culture by another, which is apparently stronger. Thus, we find that Said had cited two Orientalist projects in the 18th century. The first one is Anquetil Duperron's translation of Avestan texts. Second one is that of William Jones, who was a Justice of High Court of Bengal and member of Bengal Asiatic Society, who compared and codified the arts and sciences of Asia. Apart from that, he also has placed specific emphasis on Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. This invasion of Napoleon was the very model of a truly scientific appropriation of one culture by another, which is apparently stronger. Further, Said has given examples of Arthur James Balfour and Cromer's speeches in the House of Commons. By citing their speeches, Said says their argument was clear. There are Westerners and there are Orientals. Cromer further felt that one of the convenient things about Orientals was that managing them. Thus, an image of the Orientals was created by such personalities. Balfour and Cromer typically used the terms the Oriental is irrational, depraved, fallen, childlike, and different. Thus, European is rational, virtuous, mature, and normal. This is how Orient was created by the West. The discourse of Orientalism is the production of ideas, knowledge, and opinions about the Orient. This included certain modes of representation of the Orient through othering, where the Orient was Europe's dark other. Analyzing this discourse, Said reads a range of texts: literary, philological, philosophical, administrative, ethnographic, and others. Said has given examples of Balfour and Cromer as men who are in power and who survey the world frequently. He also has given his contemporary examples like Henry Kissinger, Gerard D. Neville's Journey to the Orient, and Edward W. Keynes' Manners and Customs of Modern Egyptians. Said demonstrates that these texts were the lens through which the Orient was viewed preliminary to being ruled. The texts were worldly in the sense they exhibit the pressures, preoccupations, and prejudices of the world around them. Therefore, no text is free of its context of production. This meant that knowledge or literary imaginations could not be considered innocent, for they were complicit with the political agenda of colonialism. The Orient was interpreted in European fashion to fulfill certain European aims. Said finely described the impact of colonialism, of worldly circumstances, of historical development by taking example from Shakespeare. Said writes, all these were to Orientalists as flies are to wanton boys, killed or disregarded for their sport, never taken seriously enough. Certain kinds of ideological assumptions informed these texts and produced stereotypes of native. The native was represented as the ignorant. The ignorance of natives, their effeminacy and indolence, their oversexed sensuous nature, their essential untrustworthiness, the superiority of the European and his knowledge. These stereotypes of the weak and stupid native helped justify and even necessitate Western presence as masculine, strong, and rational protector. The Westerner must look after the poor native who could not look after himself. Thus, the stereotype helps introduce a Western presence in various guises and roles of a protector in the form of police or army, educator in the form of a teacher, administrator in the form of bureaucracy and political presence, savior in the form of missionaries. As Said puts it, the Oriental man was first an Orient, only secondly a man. In chapter 2, Edward Said points the straight change in the attitude of the Europeans towards the Orientals. The Orientals were really publicized in the European world, especially through their literary work. Oriental land and behavior was highly romanticized by the European poets and writers and then presented to the Western world. The Orientalists had made a stage strictly for the European viewers, and the Orients were presented to them with the color of the Orientalist and other writers' perception. In fact, the Orient lands were so highly romanticized that Western literary writers found it necessary to offer pilgrimage to these exotic lands of pure sunlight and clean oceans in order to experience peace of mind and inspiration for their writing. The East was now pursued by the Orientalists as a place of pure human culture with no necessary evil in the society. Actually, it was this purity of the Orientals that made them inferior to the clever, witty, diplomatic, far-sighted Europeans. Thus, it was their right to rule and study such an innocent race. The Europeans said that these people were too naive to deal with the cruel world, and that they needed the European fatherly role to assist them. Another justification the Europeans gave to their colonization was that they were meant to rule the Orientals since they have developed sooner than Orientals as a nation. This shows that they are biologically superior, and secondly, it were the Europeans who discovered the Orients, not the Orients who discovered the Europeans. Darwin's theories were put forward to justify their superiority biologically by the Europeans. In this chapter, Said also explains how the two most renowned Orientalists of the 19th century, namely Sylvester de Sacy and Ernest Renan, worked and gave Orientalism a new dimension. In fact, Said compliments to the contribution made by Sacy in the field. He says that Sacy organized the whole thing by arranging the information in such a way that it was also useful for the future Orientalist, and secondly, the prejudice that was inherited by every Orientalist was considerably low in him. On the other hand, Renan, who took advantage of Sacy's work, was as biased as any other previous Orientalist. He believed that the science of Orientalism and the science of philology have a very important relation. After Renan, this idea was given a lot of attention, and many future Orientalists worked in its line. In Chapter 3 starts off by telling the readers how the geography of the world was shaped by the colonization of the Europeans. There was a quest for geographical knowledge which formed the basis of Orientalism. The author then talks about the changing circumstances of the world politics and changing approach to Orientalism in the 20th century. The main difference was that where the earlier Orientalists were more of silent observers, the new Orientalists took a part in the everyday life of the Orients. The earlier Orientalists did not interact a lot with the Orients, whereas the new Orients lived with them as if they were one of them. This wasn't out of appreciation of their lifestyle, but was to know more about the Orients in order to rule them properly. Lawrence of Arabia was one of such Orientalists. Then Said goes on to talk about two other scholars named Masignan and Gibb. Though Masignan was a bit liberal with the Orientalists and often tried to protect their rights, there was still inherited bias found in him for the Orientals, which can be seen in his book. With the changing world situation, especially after World War I, Orientalism took a more liberal stance towards most of its subjects. But Islamic Orientalism did not enjoy this status. There were constant attacks to show Islam as a weak religion and a mixture of many religions and thoughts. Gibbs was the most famous Islamic Orientalist of this time. After World War I, the center of Orientalism moved from Europe to USA. One important transformation that took place during this time was instances of relating it to philology, and it was related to social sciences now. All the Orientalists studied the Orientals to assist their government to come up with policies for dealing with the Orient countries. With the end of World War II, all the European colonies were lost, and it was believed that there were no more Orientals and Occidents. But this was surely not the case. Western prejudice towards Eastern countries was still very explicit, and often they managed to generalize most of the Eastern countries because of it. For example, Arabs were often represented as cruel and violent people. Japanese were always associated with karate, whereas the Muslims were always considered to be terrorists. Thus, this goes on to show that even with increasing globalization and awareness, such bias was found in the people of developed countries. Edward Said concludes his book by saying that he is not saying that the Orientalists should not make generalizations or they should include the Orient perspective too, but creating a boundary at the first place is something which should not be done. So dear friends, this is all about Edward Said's Orientalism. There had been certain critical comments made on this book, to which Edward Said responded in his 1993 book Culture and Imperialism and also 2003 edition of Orientalism. In its preface, he has dealt with the comments or the remarks made by the critics on Orientalism. Dear friends, I wish you find this video useful to you. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe this video. Thank you.